You know, I'm going to give you a history lesson.
We got some dumbass motherfuckers floating around this country.
Stop laughing! And when I do, start.
Also, y'all did some nasty-ass jokes on my ass, too.
Funny jokes and unfunny jokes come out of the same birth.
You f***ing guys are unbelievable.
Why are you laughing?
Evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Why Are You Laughing, a History of Comedy podcast. And today, I am pleased to introduce to you Don Rickles, Mr. Warmth, one of my all-time favorites, and one of the great talk show guests of all time, one of the great roasters of all time. Jerry Seinfeld has him on his Mount Rushmore of comedy. So truly one of the greats. We've gone a long time without doing an episode about him. We did the Rickles on Carson episode like a year and a half ago, but we haven't talked nearly enough about Don Rickles for a guy that was so influential in comedy, and he's another one of these guys that is sort of the godfather of a genre. There's a few guys I guess you could point to that come from the Rickles ilk, but he's definitely, I mean, if you talk about roasting, crowd work, all that kind of stuff, it was so heavily influenced by Don Rickles, and he's even invented like a way of talking. Like, there are just so many old men that are essentially doing Rickles just in their day-to-day life. Like, the Rickles' delivery was so influential, not just in comedy, but like within people, like the way people interact with each other. So truly one of my favorites, and excited to talk about him today. So hope you guys enjoy. And if you want to enjoy more episodes, go back through the archives. So often I get comments now where people are like, hey, you should do an episode about Sam Kinison. And I'm like, yeah, we did a while ago. No one was watching then. So make sure you go through the archives and check out every episode. See, at least rummage through the titles and see if any interest you, because we've done about 150 of these so far. So covered plenty of different topics. So if you've missed any, make sure you go back to the archives, available wherever you get podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, everywhere else. And if you like what you hear there, if you want bonus episodes, early access to content, consider becoming a member for as little as $5 a month on YouTube or Patreon. We appreciate those of you that subscribe there and help out the show. And I also do the Blind Mike Project and Who Are These Socials? So all those links are at blindmike.net. All the links for this show are at blindmike.net. So make sure you check that out if you'd be so kind. Don Rickles is generally the example that I use when we talk about these older guys and guys that just lived a life, and how that's so different from comedians now, where, if you do these, if you go through, an episode of WTF with Mark Maron or something from a comedian of this generation that we're currently in, they pretty much always wanted to be comics. That's a common thread for a lot of guys in comedy now, is they grew up watching Comedy Central and HBO, and they always wanted to be comics. That wasn't the case 80, 100 years ago for these guys, because stand-up didn't really exist. So they all lived a life, and Don Rickles is a great example of that. The guy served in World War II, for Christ's sake. So let's start with that, shall we?
I was in the service. Were you? You weren't in this, sir. I was in there saving your canary. Are you kidding me? I was in World War II. I know. That's true. That's true. Those pictures they don't show. 2.5 years in the USS Cyrene in the Philippines, and the Japanese came over to me and said, "Oh, my children need toys." Anyway, 2 years.
You know what's funny? Hold on, real quick. Rickles was so like charming and everything. Even when he was on Carson, I never remember him getting groans. And it's interesting because this interview was at a time where that started to shift, where even a guy like Rickles would get kind of groans for doing an accent. That was interesting to me when I was watching this, because when you watch his older stuff, everyone would know, like, hey, that's Don Rickles. And then we kind of came to a point in society where no one was safe with that stuff, where even a guy as established as Rickles, people were like, uh-oh, were we supposed to laugh at this accent he's doing? It's like, no, he's okay. He's grandfathered in. He's allowed.
What he was doing, though, is he was like kind of in and out with it, too, though.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a long, drawn-out thing to like bring a ton of attention.
Right.
I can have a show. Hey! Hey, come on. And I said, I do jokes. I did. I said, I'm an entertainer. And the guy went, entertainer? I'd like, sir, to be in special service. Special service. Okay. And I'd like to do some comedy and have a band, or a comedy and a band. Okay. Next thing you know, I'm in the Philippines, and the guy says, keep firing.
Is that really true?
I swear to God, I was on a 20 millimeter gun. You younger guys, if you know the service, it come in little cases, and I had to put it, boom, in the gun. You know, Jewish kid, we don't do that. We had a maid go lift that. Anyway,
it is funny because like they did this thing that again comics now could never imagine Tim Dillon serving in Iraq or something. You know what I mean? Like it's unfathomable. So like it's something that you can't even relate to in this generation, and yet they didn't make it a central point in their act. Like Rickles would have, I've heard him tell is some version of that story and joke that he just told in a few different places. He had that. It wasn't a central part of his act. Even there's another interview I watched where they talked about his war service. Larry King called him a war hero, and he goes, "I'm not a hero. I served." Like he's very like almost dismissive of it. Like he doesn't want to boast about how cool of a thing that is because he actually lived through it. So to someone like me, I'm like, oh, that's crazy. He served in World War II. He actually lived through it, and it probably wasn't fodder for comedy for them. So it is weird to think about now when, someone was spoken to rudely on the bus, and they do a one-man show about it. Whereas, like, Mel Brooks and Rickles and these guys fought the Nazis. It's crazy.
I don't know why that phrasing it that way is just very hilarious.
I know, but...
Next, we have him with Larry King talking about starting comedy.
He did a bunch of interviews with Larry King. I love Larry King. He's one of my favorite interviewers because he's very blunt with a lot of his questions. But him and Rickles were friends for I think they said 57 years in this interview. So he did a ton with Larry King. But this is him talking about starting comedy.
When you started, did you, comedically, did you start insulting people?
No, I don't use the word insult. It's not insult today. It's exaggeration and an attitude. Some of these kids come out today, they try to do you can't. It's part of my personality. And so I didn't plan on being comedian. I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, believe it or not. I come out of the Navy and I auditioned for the American Academy, which is a great school. And acting was my thing. I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be an actor. And the closest
you did some great movies, and you had a great TV show.
Thing I miss, Ernie Borgnine, rest his soul, just passed. My closest thing to Broadway, we did in the round.
I do have to say quickly, because it's something I would make fun of other people for. Rickles is a guy that earns the right to call him Ernie Borgnine. I'll allow it. Usually when you do it when you're like Bob De Niro or whatever, Rickles is so entrenched in Hollywood that I'll let an Ernie Borgnine pass.
He played the heavy, and I was the quiet guy.
You were Felix?
Yeah. And it worked.
You were Felix?
Yeah. I heard you. The hell is it? Felix. All you hosts do this. Where did you go when you? I know I'm here. I know. How much longer? No, I know. That's what I did. I loved acting.
So when did the comedy thing happen?
When I found out I could make money. No, not really. The comedy thing, I was always kidding around. And so I started to kibitz around on Broadway. I worked in a place where off the street, when the wind came in, it covered me with dirt. It's the truth. These little joints all around the country. Just doing that.
He said in one of his stories where he said he was always the funny kid in school and everything. He said his teacher would yell at him when he was talking to someone else in class. They'd say, "Don, what are you doing?" And he'd go, "I'm cheating." Shit like that. Like he always had that Rickles delivery, according to him.
First grade.
Yeah, right. Which is a very funny, even in the young clips of him, I can never imagine him young. He felt like he was always made to be an 80-year-old man. But he's 88 there in that interview with Larry King and still very sharp.
I just hear Mr. Potato Head.
Yeah, that's nice to reduce an entire body of work. But that is for everything he did that. I guess that's probably what our generation, if you're a dimwit like Craig, would think of him as. So I guess that's fair.
He's been with me since I was 6.
I think that Craig's on this podcast. I think of him as Mr. Potato Head.
Hey,
Great.
you did an intro talking about everything he did. I don't know, some of the biggest cartoon movies of all time. You left it out.
It's true. Where was I? Oh, so he talks
posthumously.
He talked about also the acting academy he went to too, and that's we talk about this all the time now, where these guys, they all wanted to be actors, and you hear that kind of Broadway delivery with Rickles, where he's like talking to the back of the room, and he talks about his failures in TV, which we'll get to, but he never really found, like he was. I think Carson said he had more failed pilots than the Japanese army, which is a good line. But like Rickles never had like that established TV show that made him or anything. Like he was a stand-up through and through. That's how he made. And you can. Rickles even said, like, I think the reason I was never successful in TV is because I always played it too big. Like I was on, which is interesting when you watch him. Like there's truth to that. Where it's like he's performing a little Broadway-ish, where like all of a sudden I'm on television, I'm acting. You know what I mean? Where it's like it's different than him just casually talking.
The way you would do in a play. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Next week, this is like the coolest thing. Is just the mob.
I listen to the way he talks about the mafia.
It's awesome.
This is Rickles. He seems like a very nice man. I don't think he did anything like this, but if he wanted to, could have had people gone. You never heard from him again. Absolutely. But Rickles was definitely mobbed up back in the day. Listen to how he talks about the mafia.
These guys were great. And those guys, it was, I don't want to use the word mob, you know, like you saw.
That's, by the way, the first sign that he was in the mob.
Yeah, he calls it the Cosa Nostra.
Yeah. He goes, there's no such thing as the mob.
Were great. And those guys, it was, I don't want to use the word mob, you know, like you saw that movie the other night, you know,
the one on about
Gotti and all. But hey, a lot of in my day, those men were terrific to me. I don't mean Gotti in the sense, but the whole atmosphere. Those the guys ran the clubs, and they were such gentlemen. They really were entertainers. And Sinatra will be the first one to say it. Yeah, and poor Frank in those days, you know, they used to pick on him because he would be this guy with that guy. Like, but those are the fellas that were in the nightclubs.
They ran the clubs.
Yes,
exactly right.
And Jules Podell, rest his soul, he was the best nightclub owner. You remember Jules? Podell.
Sure.
And he used to sit there and go, "Hey, no," and I pretended like I understood him. "Hey, no." And I went home at night and said to the wife, "You want to owl?"
And she went.
We didn't need that, Tom. I did it very funny, but we didn't need that.
That's the Rickles delivery I'm talking about, where it's like Tom Schneider's trying to get involved with him. Oh, Tom, we didn't. Come on. I did it okay. But
he just said it. He's just like, ugh.
He's disgusted by him.
Yeah.
So the way he and now I will say Don may be overlooking a few things that the mafia may have done, you know?
Sure did.
Turning a blind eye to a few aspects. But like he talks about Joey Gallo. Like, I don't know if you've seen that scene in The Irishman where Jim Norton is playing Rickles.
Yep.
But like in this interview, he talks about Joey Gallo like he's a misunderstood kid. You know?
He was performing the night he died.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like the way Rickles talks about the mafia is great, and it just tells you like a lot of it too is because like that's just who you had to work with as a comic back then. Particularly Rickles performing in Vegas as much as he was. Right. Some of that was he credits Sinatra for getting him involved in Vegas. But a lot of these places were mobbed up, as they say.
Well, if Sinatra's getting him going in Vegas, who is Sinatra talking to get him in Vegas?
Right. Well, Rickles makes an interesting point, though. He's like, I liked Vegas when it was a guy you dealt with, which like anyone that's been to Vegas now knows, like walk into any casino. It's not a man running it, It's not Mr. Wynn anymore.
Right.
It's a massive corporation. So Rickles is like, back then, and he blamed Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes came up and bought all the hotels and casinos and everything. And it turned very corporate after that. But he's like, back in the day, you just dealt with, some raspy voiced Italian guy that would tell me whether or not I was getting paid. So but he tells a story Another mob related story where he made made fun of some guy's wife, called her a moose or something one night.
Oh boy!
And the guy comes up to him after the show and goes, "So that's funny?" You know, it's like the Pesci scene. Like, explain to me how that's funny. And Rickles is like, come on, I'm joking. And he gets out of it somehow. And I guess Rickles told somebody. He said he called New York, I think is how he phrased it. Again, pretty awesome. but he said, so the mafia guy comes to the show the next night and meets with Don after the show again. And he goes, Don, I was in a mood. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what.
Man. Oh man.
That's some power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fucking guys that are mobbed up are apologizing to Don Rickles. That's pretty good.
Because essentially made guys can talk to whoever, however they want. So
and I don't know. I have no idea who this guy. He obviously didn't name him. I have no idea who this guy was or what level he was at or anything. But whoever it was made a mistake by mouthing off to Don Rickles.
No, but like even a soldier is above Don Rickles because he's not a made guy. So the fact that happened is awesome.
It's also just funny to think of this like little Jewish wiseacre. You know what I mean?
Well, the Jews were notoriously the mob's best friends.
Sure. Save that for Rubbed Out, folks. Verygoodshow.org.
It's true. It's true. Next, we have him talking about movies.
So he's been in some movies. He never had massive successes other than stand-up. And I think now that's very common, where guys can not just make a living, but have a massive living. You look at the guys on tour now, whether it's Shane Gillis or Andrew Schultz or Tony Hinchcliffe or Segura and Kreischer and all these guys that are just playing arenas. You can make tens of millions, hundreds of millions, whatever it is. Back in the day, that wasn't really the case. But guys like Rickles were able to carve out a living because they were so funny. They could sell out theaters, and that's what they were known for, was stand-up. But he's had some movie roles, and this is him talking about that.
Let me ask you about your own career as a movie actor. You were in Run Silent, Run Deep with Clark Gable.
I carried Clark Gable.
Or Clark Gable. And
I carried both of them. They're dead now, so they can't say anything. But I did carry them both. Burt Lancaster used to come up to me and say, "Hi, Don. Are you ready to do the scene?" I said, "Go away, Burt. Go away."
You did not.
No, I didn't. I respected Burt. Clark was great. Well, Burt was too, but Clark always used to say to me, "You know something, kid? I think you're a good actor." And I used to say, "Thank you, Clark." But I got to tell you, Lancaster and the thing with Gable, how to do a screen test. And it was Henry Slate, the rest of the soul. I used to work in the Slate Brothers. And in those days, we both, the martinis were coming pretty good. And we had to be up there early in the morning. And I had what they call a work light. And I stood on the set and a voice said, and I played a sailor in Run Silent, and a voice said, "Mr. Rickles, we're going to do this scene now. And you'll be talking to Mr. Gable." I said, Clark Gable going to be there? No. There's no Mr. Gable. It's just an actor off stage that'll do the lines with you. And you just say the lines and this voice will answer to you. And I had this work light and I couldn't see anything. It was darkness. And I went, "The men are tired. The ship is ready to sink, sir. What are we going to do?" And a voice went, "Take it down 100 feet and dive. Don't be afraid. Attack. And I went, cut. I started to spit up.
Oh, really?
It was Gable.
Yeah.
I spit up. I couldn't believe it was Clark Gable. And then I met him later, and I found out I was bigger than he was.
It is like, for you kids out there like Craig that don't remember anything before Toy Story, Clark Gable was like the guy back in the day. He was a massive star. And I think that clip to me is very representative of Rickles' style, where he starts out insulting, quote unquote, these guys, like saying, "I carried them," and then massively complimenting them and talking about like how intimidated he was by Clark Gable, and then kind of poking him again at the end. Like, that is such vintage Rickles. Like when he said to Larry King, you heard in one of the prior clips where Larry said, "You're an insult comic," and he corrects the interviewer every time they say that. I watched a bunch where they're like, "insult." They always use that word, insult, and he goes, "I don't agree with that." He goes, I understand that it's that's how I'm known. It's associated. That word is associated with me. He goes, "I don't feel that I'm insulting people," and he's always very clear about that, and it is true. And I will say, I think some comics now get unfairly criticized for being as vulgar as they are, Because if you watch the Comedy Central roasts, say, they're much meaner than the Dean Martin roasts.
Oh yeah.
And that's for some people, that's a criticism of the Comedy Central roasts. I don't agree with that because I think that's the natural evolution where you have a little, like, the Dean Martin roasts are kind of what started that, and the Friars roast, that stuff back in the day, is what started that genre of comedy. The natural evolution is for it to get harsher and meaner because you have to surprise people. You can't keep doing the Rickles, like, tame jokes, because at the time those weren't tame. That's what you have to remember. Like, people called Rickles the merchant of venom. Whereas, like, you look at some of those clips now and you're like, oh, he's a very sweet old man. He's busting their chops a little bit, you know? Right. We don't see it as mean as they saw it on NBC in 1974.
Right. I was going to say, the way they watched back then is the way we watch the Comedy Central ones now.
Exactly, yeah. So I think it's a little unfair when they're like, oh, it's so mean. But I will say a major difference that it is fair to criticize these current roasts or more modern roasts for is what made those roasts great back then is Hollywood was such a small circle of people.
Yep.
That for the most part, I think with some exceptions, but for the most part, like, those were all actual friends roasting each other.
Right.
I mean, we'll get to Newhart, obviously, but, like, even not necessarily as close as that, but they've all worked together a bunch. They go out and drink together. They go on vacations together. Like, those were real friends. It wasn't like, hey, Charlie Sheen, we're gonna have a Mike Tyson and Anthony Jeselnik, like, these people that have never met you. You know what I mean? Like, it's very weird.
Right. Next, we have him talking about his influence.
Oh yeah, so there was a guy named Jackie Leonard that I believe he talks about here, that a lot of people say Rickles was heavily influenced by or stole from or whatever. He addresses that in this clip.
I really love to watch you work, but then I've always liked Jackie Leonard, so...
Not a bad line by Dick Cavett, by the way.
Great line.
Jackie Leonard's a great... I always get ribbed about that, you know that.
He always ribs.
But we are completely different. Jack is doing very well. He's in Las Vegas with his family, and we always rib each other about comparing, as you do in opera. I'm sure people compare you, and as long as you're successful and doing well, it's great. It's when you're struggling and they try to wipe you out, then it's rough, you know.
Yeah. We were saying that before you came on, how hard it must have been at the very beginning before people knew who you were and what kind of comic you were.
Yeah, well,
you know, to suddenly walk into a club and here's this guy insulting everybody.
Well, I was really before my time, to be very honest, because today I do the things that are today, and I was doing that 20 years ago, and it's funny how people say, he says terrible things, he wipes people out, you know, and all I do is laugh at ourselves. And I think there's ways of some people saying, gee, he said some offbeat words or what have you. And I think it's in the eyes of the beholder in the sense that the best way I can describe what I do, my father, rest his soul, and you were very close to your mother, and I'm very close to my family too. My dad, rest his soul, he was the kind of a man that put his arms around a woman. And when he did, it wasn't dirty. And there were other guys that give a woman a hug, and right away at the party, your wife's looking over at the husband going, Charlie, get the hell out of here, you know. So it's the way you do something. Now, being on this show, like I tell Dick from the bottom of my heart, I never liked you.
another classic Rickles line. But he even does that with, I talked about, like, sort of the insult sandwich or whatever you want to call it, where an ebb and flow between insulting you and complimenting you. He would even do that with interviewers, where he would bust Dick Cavett's balls there. I listened to him, like, do it with Charlie Rose or Conan or whoever he was talking to at the time, Tom Snyder. But then he always proves he knows something about them and compliments them. And like right there, you heard him say, like, I know you're very close with your mother, Dick. Like, he learned things about the people he was talking to and paid a great deal of respect to them. And that's something that is very different, where now you have guys, if you're seen as the edgy guy, the insult guy, the mean comic, you feel like you have to be a tough guy all the time. I think we're seeing that a little bit of that with Anthony Jeselnik and his current press tour. But like with Rickles, he would almost kill you with kindness so that he could insult you, and that you would also be laughing along. It wasn't to show people how shocking he was. It felt like he really liked the people he was around. And it was I'm trying to think of who I heard him talk about. Oh, it was Milton Berle. Because I wanted to mention Milton Berle because he said Jackie Leonard was not the influence of his. It was Milton Berle coming up. He was a big Milton Berle fan. And he got to roast Milton Berle at a lot of these Dean Martin things. And it was interesting to hear him talk to, it might have been Charlie Rose, I can't remember. But he was talking about Milton Berle, and he's like, I was a big Milton Berle fan, and then I got to know him, and I kind of learned, I learned the pattern to a lot of what he was doing. Have you ever heard anyone talk about Milton Berle? He's a known joke thief. Like, he was stealing from everybody. I don't think he was even trying to hide it. And so it's interesting to hear Rickles talk about a guy in a way where it's like, it's almost like that's the real insult of going like, I was a Milton Berle fan and then I got to know him. I'm good friends with him and I learned the pattern of what he was doing. It's kind of like saying, I figured out the shtick, Yeah,
it was the guy before him.
Yeah, so it's almost the guys that Rickles wasn't insulting were the ones that he probably didn't respect that much.
Next we have talking about Carson.
Yeah, I mean, Carson, obviously, one of, if not the biggest influence on Rickles' career. Like, those Tonight Show appearances are legendary. I mean, for my money, like, Norm Macdonald, I think, is the greatest talk show guest ever. I think maybe if I was born in the 70s, I would probably say Don Rickles. Because even at my age, Don Rickles is one of my favorites ever. And his chemistry with Carson was fantastic. I don't know if I've watched a lot of Carson interviews, and I don't know if I've ever seen anyone better with him than Rickles. And I always felt Rickles should have been the last guest. It was Robin Williams for some reason, which I know Robin Williams was a big star at that time and everything. But I always felt like Rickles should have been because to me, he is the model for what Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was.
I was watching a couple of weekends ago. Carson's got this set of cassettes out with all the great moments from the Tonight Show. And you're in there several times. Most notably the night that he's in the geisha house with the swimming pool.
That was so
what a night. I know that you and he are pals, and I know you must remember those days very, very fondly.
Oh, yeah. Carson was...
Jesus, you guys were funny together.
Well, he set you up, Tom, like you do in a way, you do. He made it, like he listened, and he made you funny. If you had any ability with Johnny, he was a great setup artist. He would sit back and then wait for his shots, and he'd get us some good rippers off, believe me. But it was fun to be with him when you were on the show because you never knew what was going to happen. We'd have 40 million notes, and none of that was ever discussed. It was just right off the top of what you got, right the cream, right off the can there.
We played in the Carson Rickles episode that we did. We played probably the most famous instance from Rickles on the Tonight Show, where he broke Carson's cigar box, and then the next night Carson walked over to the set of CPO Sharkey that was filming next door and confronted him. And Rickles said like that was genuine. He goes, obviously he was kidding, but like it was genuine that I didn't know it was happening, and like he shocked me, and that's what made Rickles find it so funny. And I think there are a lot of guys that could have done that, guest hosted and broken Carson's cigar box, and they would just never be on the Tonight Show again. We wouldn't even know about it. It would just never, because that's how cold-blooded Carson was with a lot of things. If something bothered him, he'd just cut you out. He was cutthroat like that. But like he truly loved Rickles, you could tell. And Johnny would do this on the show, but Rickles said he would also do this when he was at Rickles' live shows. Rickles goes, he likes to bend the elbow, and he would do this thing. Like Rickles at a certain point in his career did have his like stock jokes, so he would say things like, he'd make a joke and then he'd go, the black guy over there didn't seem to like that one, and Carson would go, which black guy, Don? show me and like to have that chemistry, because like that could ruin a show. But if it's Carson and Rickles, like they know each other well enough to call one another out like that,
It's a great improv group by accident.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next we have him roasting Clint Eastwood.
This is another, he said the two biggest like impacts on his career outside of stand-up, he said Kelly's Heroes and then Casino. as far as like roles that he had that people ask him about and everything. So he was in Kelly's Heroes with Eastwood and Carol O'Connor. I think Donald Sutherland was in that. So a pretty big cast, and he was always friends with Clint Eastwood. That's another thing. We talked about this with Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks and a lot of these older guys. I think you can tell a lot about them. Newhart, obviously. I think you can tell a lot about them by the relationships that they had with each other, where these are guys that kept genuine friendships for 50, 60 years in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these weren't guys that, did some show together and pretended to be friends. Like, comics now that it started out as friends, you'll hear them say that they're at the point where it's like they see each other to do the podcast that they do with each other. They're essentially business partners that almost masquerade as friends. These were guys that were at each other's homes for, like, Rickles and Newhart went to each other's house for Christmas Eve every year. Like,
Right.
These were real friends. And I don't know how close he was with Eastwood. I think that might have been more of a Hollywood type of friendship. But when you hear when you hear Rickles roast Eastwood, you can tell there is genuine, like, love and respect there.
I do want to say, those of you that ate the fish, you will die. Clint, I say with due respect, 28 years ago we did Kelly's Heroes, and I haven't heard from you since. Clint, I say it, nobody else has said it, and I say it from my heart. You're a lousy actor.
So simple.
Yeah.
And it's just something, like, I think there's a lot of comics that could have delivered that line to Eastwood, and it might have fallen flat. For a couple of reasons. They don't have Rickles' delivery or timing, but also, like, Rickles had a cachet where he could say that to Clint Eastwood, whereas another comic saying that to Clint Eastwood,
Yeah.
you'd be thinking, what do you mean? No, he isn't. That's crazy. What are you talking about? But Rickles just had that thing where that would make you weren't questioning it at all. You weren't thinking, like, Don, you've had 40 sitcoms canceled. What are you talking about? You didn't think of that because of his perfect timing and perfect delivery.
Speaking of 40 sitcoms getting canceled, we're going to talk about TV failures.
Yeah, so this is him kind of explaining why that was.
I happen to enjoy film and television, and they make jokes that I had many opportunities on television, which I did, but unfortunately the ratings were not that great because I only had a limited audience called America.
But what I don't understand, do you think, Don, is the fact that anybody who has seen you work in a nightclub knows, I mean, you are one of the great nightclub comedians of all time. Do you think television limits you, the fact that it's this little box?
I don't know. When you're an in-person performer, you have to capture what I do. That goes pretty much with most people. But when you're unique, as I like to think I am, and I know I am, the secret has never been able to, the expression is harnessed, that I can do what I do and put on that box so that comes across what Don Rickles is really all about. I believed in C.P.O. Sharkey, a show he had on. I thought that was very funny. Unfortunately, the rating system it's you live and die by it. So not to do bad news, but it just didn't make it, so to speak. And ever since then, I've heard a few people who are with the networks.
C.P.O. Sharkey might have been the longest run that he had. It was on for a couple of seasons. He did another show. We mentioned this in our Richard Lewis episode. He did a show called Daddy Dearest with Richard Lewis, which I think was hurt by the title. It's a terrible title because you don't expect it to be Richard Lewis and Don Rickles.
Well, if you're looking at a TV guide and you see Daddy Dearest, you're like, I'm not fucking watching that.
You think it's a show like a little rich girl or something like that. You
Right.
know what I mean? Like, you don't think it's Richard Lewis having to take care of his aging father, Don Rickles, you know? But to me, like, that feels like it should have been perfect for both of them, honestly. Like, that actually feels like perfect casting. So I'm surprised something like that didn't work. But, like we said before, maybe just he just was never a good enough actor to keep a TV show on, or wasn't believable in certain roles. I don't know what it was, but the guy was made for stand-up through and through, Go ahead.
I was going to say, because he says he was like really on.
Yeah.
and all that. Like if you watch Casino, it's almost like why was he even cast? Because it's not even close to being him.
Well, we have Scorsese explain that a little later, I think. But yeah, he was made for stand-up, and he just lived in a time where guys like that felt like they had to get on television or get into movies or something. But I think he got to a point where he knew what he was. He was content doing stand-up, particularly in his later years. Like I said, he worked more or less until he died. But speaking of something that did work on television, one thing that is on YouTube in full, but I watched it when it was on HBO. It came out in 2006. It was a documentary entitled Mr. Warmth, the nickname that Carson gave him.
Yeah.
That was great. That's actually what made me, I guess I would have been 14 or 15 when that came out. That's what made me a Rickles fan. Because what it is half documentary, half special, which I actually don't love that format. They've done a few of those. I know, like Larry David, the first episode of Curb is like that. Gary Gulman did one like that, The Great Depression. Personally, I would rather watch an hour stand-up special and then an hour documentary, I don't need them mixed. But it is very well done. It's directed by John Landis, actually. But it's very well done. And in that, Chris Rock, I thought, had a great quote where he said, for whatever reason, Rickles is like a girl with big tits, where you'll just let him say whatever you want to them. like they can get away with anything. He's like, I don't know what it is about this guy, but like, I think because of his charm and everything. And like, we talk about this when we talk about certain people that emulate Howard Stern. I'm thinking of one of Howard's former employees in particular. There are people who observe Stern and say like, oh, well, he's just saying crude things. I can say crude things. I can ask a girl about her pussy or something. But they don't have the same charm and delivery. They're not as intelligent. Like, I don't think Howard really gets enough respect for being as smart as he is. So all these factors created Howard Stern. It wasn't just, hey, let me throw baloney at this stripper's ass,
Mm-hmm.
And Rickles has a little bit of that, where you can't just go up to someone and, hey, lose some weight, hockey puck. It doesn't make sense if it's not coming out of Don Rickles' mouth, And so that's, I think, a very important thing, and that goes to what Chris Rock was talking about, where I just thought that was a great line. But
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But here we have him talking about performing for Reagan.
Yeah, so he did perform for a couple presidents. H.W. Bush, I think maybe one other. I could be wrong. But Reagan and H.W. he performed for.
Sinatra was important for you, wasn't he? I mean, the fact that he really enjoyed you. I mean, you
Well,
tear
here's
him
a
up
typical example, Larry. Frank Sinatra, the inaugural for the President of the United States last year last January, I was invited to Washington. I was in Hawaii, and Frank called me. And it was only because of Frank Sinatra. I'm sure the President and Mrs. Reagan naturally agreed. But Frank was the guy that put his best foot forward and said, I must have Rickles on the show, and nothing's to be written for him. He can walk out and do a 5-minute spot, and I trust what he will say and do, and let him do his thing and make fun of the cabinet and the government and what have you, and I guarantee it'll come off okay. And I'm indebted for Frank for that, and it was a marvelous show and a great treat for me because I thought I would never get an opportunity to appear before the president. And then we went to the White House later, and the president wanted to hang with me, but of course I was busy, and I couldn't give him too much time.
It's another great, again, I'm not sure if he ever did anything for Clinton or Obama, but like the idea that he performed for Reagan and Bush, like now that would be seen as, oh, he's a Republican. And it would marginalize him in some way because people would be judging him politically, even though he's not political at all. And that's a thing that I think comedy is kind of lost. Like, I have no idea. Maybe people that have studied him better than I have could tell you. I have no idea who Don Rickles ever voted for. I couldn't give you a guess. I mean, maybe Reagan based on this or something. Like, I don't know. But like, politically, he did not move the needle in one direction or the other. He was just funny. It didn't. There were no like, oh, he performed for Reagan, so I'll never watch him again. That just didn't exist back then,
back then, a lot of people kind of just respected The Office and didn't like it wasn't like a team mentality.
Right. And the other thing from that clip that shout out to Sinatra, obviously, like the first, the legend is. I always do question some of these because they become such perfect like talk show snippets, Yeah. But the story that Don always tells is that he was working at a restaurant in Florida, and Sinatra walked in, and Don walked up to him, which takes a lot of balls in general to just be an employee and annoy Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
But Rickles walked up to him and said, Frank, why don't you just be yourself and hit somebody? What do you say? And he said that the Rat Pack or whoever was with him, he goes, the way Rickles tells the story is like, they all look around like, are we allowed to laugh at this? And Sinatra laughed his ass off. And he was like, I like this guy. And they became friends over the years, and Sinatra obviously did a lot for him, like I said, helping him get into Vegas and all kinds of stuff like that. And so our next clip is Sinatra, right?
Yep.
This is my favorite story ever. I just love this moment so much.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is perfect Rickles, and I think Frank does a good job telling it here on Carson.
Listen, can I tell a story about what this man did to me once? You may have known or heard about this. It was a true story. This was a long time ago, long before Don got married. I was eating dinner in a restaurant in New York, and I was sitting with some friends, and he came over to the table, and he said, Frank, do me a favor, will you? He said, I'm sitting with a very pretty girl, and I'm trying to make out, and he said, I told her I know you, and she really doesn't believe me. Would you stop by the table? I said, all right. I was just about finished. I was down to the espresso. And finally, he went back, and I walked by the table, and I said, how are you, Don? Nice to see you. He said, can't you see I'm eating, Frank? What are you doing? I watched the whole
thing. Which is, hilarious by Rickles, obviously, but also kind of a smart move to be like, I'm not going to show this girl I'm friends with Rickles. I'm going to show him I'm Sinatra. I'm going to show her I own Sinatra. Get the fuck out of here, Frank.
That's so funny.
It's so good. And there's also in the Larry King clip we played before when he's talking about Reagan, he said that at the inauguration, Nancy Reagan walked up to him to thank him for doing such a great job and say hello. And he goes, Nancy, don't you see I'm talking to someone? Like, Rickles did have these stock lines, which I think is just symptomatic of the time he was in, where you couldn't just put a compilation together like, hey, here's him on Dick Cavett and Larry King saying the same thing, Yeah. But he reminds me a lot of, or I should say, this guy reminds me of Don. Mark Normand now does 40 million podcasts and uses a lot of the same lines over and over again. But there's something about his delivery and his timing that he gets away with it. You're more accepting of him doing it than you would be someone else. And I think Rickles has a lot of that, where it's like, I've heard him do that line before, but it's still funny because it was so perfect. Rickles did a series, I think this is right before he died, and you can tell it's heavily edited because the guy's 90 years old at this time. You can tell he's starting to lose it a little bit, but he did this. It's on like the AARP YouTube channel, which is I didn't know existed, but it's called Dinner with Don, and he had like De Niro and Scorsese on, and Billy Crystal, Kimmel. Kind of weird interviews. I wish it was more Rickles guys, I wish they had Newhart on or something. But the Zach Galifianakis one is great because Don's like, we've never met before, have we? And Zach goes, actually once. He goes, I walked up to you and said, Mr. Rickles, nice to meet you. I'm a big fan. And you just said, hello, Rabbi, and kept walking. Which I think is such a hilarious, if you look at Zach Galifianakis, that's a perfect line, but nowhere near the first one you would think of.
Never.
You know what I mean? Like homeless or woodsman or something. You just, hello, Rabbi, and you keep going. Like that to me is the Rickles timing that makes anything he says that quickly funny. Like he has such a perfect delivery for that you can hear the same lines more than once and still makes you laugh just as hard.
Absolutely. But I will say, for having stock lines, the "can't you see I'm eating here?" I'm like, "Can't you see I'm talking, Nancy?" Just doing that to people infinitely more
Hilarious.
famous than you is
Well,
funny every time.
It's funny to do it to Nancy Reagan, the first lady.
Yes.
I think it's even funnier to do it to Sinatra when you asked him to go over there.
You asked him to go over there, and at the time, he was the biggest thing in the world.
He was bigger than the first lady or the president in some sort. Like
Yeah.
Italians, just random Italians had photos of Frank Sinatra on their wall. Like,
Right.
just for no reason. It was the family and then Frank Sinatra.
It was the family, the Pope, Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, he was the king back then. So to do it to that guy is hysterical.
Next-
One other thing I wanted to mention is it's very funny. It just reminded me because Sinatra said it was before he was married. Rickles was married to his lovely wife for, I think, over 50 years by the time he passed. It's very funny because if you watch interviews with him, he's like, well, I got married very late in life. He got married at like 39. And it's funny to hear it, like, me knowing they were married for 50 years and be like, yeah, I was an old maid, you know?
Hey, technically, I guess.
Yeah.
Next week, I'm talking about offending people.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty good summation, and it does show you, because like I said, to us, he almost feels like cute in these times. You know what I mean? When you hear how like vulgar, like now you're allowed. I know we talk about like cancel culture and everything, but as far as words, more or less, you're allowed to say anything.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to cursing or whatever. You can pretty much say whatever the fuck you want. So now, like, a lot of Rickles' lines almost seem, like, cute. But this is how you can tell he was not only a real comic, but a guy who kind of had to fight for free speech in a lot of ways.
No, I want to say, Mr. Leibovitz, I really have never on the stage, anything I've ever done, I've never taken back, in the sense that when I stand out there, you have to believe in what you do. If for one moment you say, oh, I shouldn't have said that, you're a fool. As an entertainer, this is in my own opinion and what I do. When I'm out there, I'm doing my best to make people laugh, and I'm doing with all earnesty. I'm not out there to hurt somebody. If it comes off that way, I'm sorry in my heart, but I never take it back. In other words, I perform with my soul and with my honesty, and I think that's what makes me go.
I think somewhere we kind of lost that mentality. I think that's the perfect answer that like comics should still be using.
Yes.
And I think because of the context, sometimes they feel the need to like dig their heels in and either be like, fuck you, or the exact opposite. Well, I'm terribly sorry. Release some notes statement on Instagram, you know, like they overreact where it's like, that's actually the perfect answer. And you forget, like I said, because he became the guy for our generation that you wanted to get insulted by. Like in my lifetime, anytime you saw Rickles on TV, you know, Jimmy Kimmel was hoping Rickles would make fun of him. Like that was the dream.
Right.
Back then, people didn't necessarily know. When he recorded Hello Dummy, his album, like people didn't even necessarily know what to expect from Don Rickles. So when he makes a joke about your wife or about, you know, the Asian guy in the front row, or like, people didn't know whether or not to be offended. They had to learn who Don Rickles was, and they allowed him to do that. And I think that's something people forget when they say, like, oh, there's no cancel culture now because Shane Gillis and Tony Hinchcliffe are really popular. It's like, yeah, but what that does for a lot of younger comics is think like, oh, well, I'm not allowed to do that. They can get away with it, but I'm not even going to attempt it because I'll get in trouble. I'll have something taken away from me, you know?
He's got he's influenced so many people, but it's like you talked about, I think it was Skank Fest. You and the Skirt ran into Rich Voss.
Mm-hmm.
And
oh yes,
he did the "what do you need" thing, and you basically like fist pumped because it's exactly what you want.
Yeah. For anyone that doesn't know that story, my girlfriend and I went to Skankfest, and she didn't know Rich Voss that well, and then we saw him on a show, and she was like, "Oh, he was so funny," and then he was kind of standing around after the show talking to someone, and my girlfriend goes, "Oh, let's tell him how funny he was," and I go, "That's okay," and she goes, "No, I'm gonna." And she walks up to him and she goes, "Oh my God, like you did such a good job. You were so and he like is like half listening, and then he turns to her and goes, "What do you need?" And she goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she was like, "Why was he like that?" And I was like, No, that's the perfect
You're like, that was awesome.
Yeah, that was great. But it's funny. I'm glad you brought that up actually, because like so influential on that group of guys, particularly like Voss and Norton. You can see Don Rickles all over them. Norton, Rich Voss too, but Norton's a great example on the radio.
Yeah,
like the quickness of a lot of those lines. That's why I was so glad that Jim Norton got to play him in The Irishman.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Because I think you could tell Jim Norton's the guy I've probably listened to for more hours than anyone in my life, between Opie and Anthony and Jim and Sam and all the stand-up he's done and all the podcasts he's done and everything. I've heard his voice more than maybe anyone else. And you hear so much of Rickles in him. Norm as well, which we'll get to. But definitely a lot of Jim Norton, and even like Nick DiPaolo, you can hear a lot of Rickles in there.
For sure. And I'll also say, in terms of joke structure, not like sound necessarily, but the structure would be like Jeselnik.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, a lot, all those roast guys, really. Jeff Ross. Jeff Ross told a story on Conan's podcast about how Rickles would always give him shit for writing his jokes. Like, Rickles said he never wrote his jokes down, which is pretty crazy to me if that's true.
That's nuts.
But he would like give Jeff Ross shit for writing his jokes. And so Jeff Ross went to Don Rickles' funeral. He knew him fairly well. And Rickles' manager went up to Jeff at the funeral and said, hey, would you mind saying a few words? And Jeff Ross was like, this is Don teaching me I should go up without writing shit. This is his like, all right, let's see what you can do. You're stealing my act? Let's see if you've got it.
All right, we are at our last two clips.
Oh, man. All right. We got Newhart. This is really a beautiful relationship. Judd Apatow did a very cool mini documentary. It's like 20, 25 minutes, something like that. I think it was for the New Yorker, but it's on YouTube. Just search Bob and Don, A Love Story by Judd Apatow. It's about their friendship, which really, everyone called this like an odd couple relationship, which I guess I understand it if you listen to both their acts.
Yeah.
The buttoned up mind of Bob Newhart. He's a very straight-laced guy, where Rickles is a little crazier and edgier for that time and everything. But like, to me, it is like the perfect encapsulation of male friendship. Rickles told us they would like vacation together, them and their wives. And Rickles told a story. They were in Germany once, and they were walking down like a big sidewalk or something that Rickles was describing. And Rickles said he started goose stepping. And Bob goes, oh, no, Don, please. Don. And Rickles goes, what? I've got a cramp. And Bob goes, please, just for the love of God. And Rickles is goose stepping through Germany. and Rickles like would fuck with him in public and annoy the waiter and things that would like get Bob very annoyed. To me, like that encapsulates every male friendship, or most, where like the more outgoing one embarrasses the more straight-laced one. Right. And I'm actually shocked they never had like a buddy. Maybe they were close enough that they didn't want to work together, strain the friendship in any way. But I was always shocked they didn't have some kind of buddy comedy together, because to me it seems like perfect casting. But the other thing that it made me think of is, like I said, if it's the perfect encapsulation of male friendship, the straight-laced guy also gets a few good digs in, which I think this might be, like, from what I've seen, I don't know if I want to call it the best, but definitely like holds up the best. It's one of the best Dean Martin roast sets that I've seen. I think Newhart kills here when he's roasting Don Rickles.
Don is my best friend, which just gives you some idea of the difficulty I have in making friends. As some of you may have already known, Don's hotel room was recently robbed. The only thing that was taken was the music to Don's act.
Hold on. We talked about this with Red Fox too. These guys just came up in a time where they felt like they had to be song and dance men.
Right.
And Rickles would like sing at times. And it's so funny, and you hear the reaction he gets. It's so funny for Newhart to call that out. And that's, again, only something, like, you have to be friends to get away with certain shit like that. You know what I mean? Like to call out the guy's act to his face. Like, that's how you know they were actual friends.
The Chicago police have picked up 33,000 people who might have had a possible motive. Don is just about to sign one of the largest deals in the history of Las Vegas. Why he is signing Frank's deal, we'll never know. But Don has not done that well in television. He's had 4 series now. The last one, a couple of Dons received a -4 Nielsen rating. This means not that no one watching, but several people without TV sets had heard about the show and said if they got one, they wouldn't watch it.
And that's, again, like, I feel like if you were a Newhart fan back then, you might see the tone of those roasts and be like, oh boy, how's Bob Newhart going to do? And then you watch it and you realize, like, oh, that's how you know they were actual friends, like Newhart's ability to do that, you know?
They talk like that when the cameras aren't on.
Exactly. Yes. Like, that's their relationship, I think.
Yeah.
And you hear that. I mean, there's a million clips of Rickles roasting Newhart. I'm going to butcher it, but he says that some of the effect of Newhart's a cerebral comic, and I'm the kind of guy that gets laughs. Newhart also tells the story of how the first night Bob Newhart's wife saw Don's act. She had met Don, and she's like, I thought he was a lovely guy, and they started to become friends and everything. And Bob was like, just so you know, like, this is going to be a little different. Like, fair warning, like, just be aware.
This will be jarring.
And Rickles saw them walk in, and he goes, "Oh, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Newhart is here with a hooker from Bayonne." So yeah, like I said, that's how you knew they were like real friends. And again, like those relationships I like to hear, like we talked about with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. Like, those are very cool relationships because they were true friends. It wasn't, Hollywood horseshit.
And before we get to our last clip, we were talking about Scorsese. I guess we don't have that clip.
Oh, right. I didn't find it that interesting, actually. I forgot about that.
Never mind that.
No, I did. I guess I just didn't want to clip it for whatever reason. But Scorsese talked about how he booked Rickles on Casino because he wanted to give the movie like an old school Vegas feel, and he was like, who's more representative of Vegas than Don Rickles, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, it wasn't him being a Ricklesy guy, but I think Scorsese kind of just wanted to pay homage to Vegas by having a guy like that in there, which I think is and Scorsese, as you can tell from some of his other casting, likes working with comedians, Yeah,
right. It's probably a good call not clipping it, I guess.
I summed it up pretty well.
Pretty concise.
But all right, so we haven't gotten to shoehorn our boy Norman to an episode lately. So I was glad to finally be able to do it because Norm is another guy you can tell loves Don Rickles and was so influenced by him. Yeah. And I said Norm is kind of like I said, Norm's my favorite talk show guest ever. Mm-hmm. And his talk show father, or two fathers, I guess, would be Rickles and Rodney. Because in a lot of those interviews, he's just straight up doing Rickles and Rodney. Yeah. I think Rodney more so, but there's a lot of lines that he purposely delivers exactly like Don Rickles. There's even one, there was like a 10-second one where he throws a joke out at some award show and he goes, that was a little Don Rickles there. Like he just acknowledges it.
He will do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this is him and obviously Don Rickles was in the cult classic Dirty Work with Artie Lang and Norm Macdonald. I think that's where Artie got was known as the Baby Gorilla, from that Baby Gorilla line in Dirty Work. I think that was the first reference to it. It came up a lot on Stern. But Rickles called him a baby gorilla in Dirty Work and roasted them, and a lot of hilarious stories came out of it, including this one.
right?
Yeah.
So everybody's like, fuck, we can't bring up Sinatra, because, Rickles and Sinatra are pretty close.
Yeah.
So, but finally I said, I'm going to fucking ask him like at lunch, how Frank's doing.
Yeah.
So I go, listen, Don, man, I don't want to bum you out or anything, but, because he was on his deathbed and everything. I go, have you seen Frank? He goes, yeah, I saw him last week. It was a lot of this. And then he goes, no, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of me 2 inches from his face going, I'm not Barbara. So
he wasn't that emotional.
Yeah, this guy is fucking real.
Right.
So he was that guy then. Like Rickles really was that guy, and that's why it never came across as phony, because he really was that. And it was it's a beautiful thing because it's, I think, lost on a lot of people, where it's like his ability to kind of massage the relationship of whoever he was talking with, where he compliments you enough that you enjoy being shit on by him. And that's an art form that I don't know that it really exists anymore. So shout out to Don Rickles, one of my true favorites. I think I held off on doing this episode for a long time because I was nervous about fucking it up because I like Don Rickles so much. So I hope, let me know in the comments if we missed anything, because we can always do a Don Rickles part 2. But I would hate to think I missed something for one of the true greats and someone who's definitely in my upper echelon of comedians of all time. So,
and before you comment that we missed him on Carson, there was a whole episode dedicated to it.
We did a whole episode about it. Yeah, go back and watch it. Like, you can watch every episode if you go to blindmike.net. You can go through the whole archives, for God's sake. Preferably on YouTube, I guess, where you can like, comment, share, subscribe. All that helps more people find the program. We appreciate you doing that. Help more eyeballs find this thing. Every once in a while we get comments saying, hey, these videos should have more views. Why Are You Laughing should be more popular. Well, do something about it, for God's sake. Spread the word out there. And you can subscribe on Patreon or YouTube for as little as $5 a month. We appreciate you doing that and supporting the show. You can support Craig, where they're doing a full Toy Story breakdown and calling it the pinnacle of Don Rickles' career.
I never said that.
Craig called it the only good thing he's done.
Yep, I did.
And you can do that at verygoodshow.org.
That's right.
All right. Anything else?
Nope.
We'll talk to you guys next time on Why Are You Laughing?
Zip it up and zip it out.